A reading from Genesis. Then Laban said to Jacob, "Because you are my kinsman, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall your wages be?" Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were lovely, and Rachel was graceful and beautiful. Jacob loved Rachel. So he said, "I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter, Rachel." Laban said, "It's better that I give her to you than I should give her to any other man. Stay with me." So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. Then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife that I may go in to her, for my time is completed." So Laban gathered together all the people of the place and made a feast. But in the evening he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and he went in to her. Laban gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter Leah to be her maid. When morning came, it was Leah. And Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? Did I not serve with you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me?" Laban said, "This is not done in our country, giving the younger before the firstborn. Complete the week of this one, and we will give you the other also in return for serving me another 7 years." Jacob did so, and completed her week. Then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel as a wife. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
This is not a good story. What are we even supposed to learn from it? And I've heard some poor takes on this passage, and maybe you've heard them too. Be like Jacob and continue to persevere even when you are wronged. Be like Jacob and don't stop until you get what is yours. Find a love like Jacob and Rachel's. Jacob loved Rachel so much, he worked for 14 years and had to marry Leah before he could marry his beloved Rachel. Even the scholars and commentators who devote their lives to studying Bible stories just like this one come up short. In this story, we finally see the great deceiver Jacob get deceived. There's so much humor in this story. Jacob wakes up the morning after his wedding and realizes the woman he married is not who he intended to marry. It's true that Jacob is finally deceived. Jacob, the one who tricked his father, who could not see, into giving him his older brother's birthright, is then tricked by his apparent inability to not see that he was marrying Leah instead of Rachel. While commentators may see the humor in this, and yes, the argument can be made for the humor in this passage, I just don't see it. This is not a funny story. This is not a story for us to learn to persevere like Jacob. This is not a story of some great love. And this is not a story for us to give a great ha at Jacob finally getting what's coming to him. My guess is that we have all heard this story many times before. And if we haven't heard this specific story, we've probably heard stories just like it. So much so that we've become desensitized to it. We likely don't even think twice about everything that happens when we hear the story. We don't think about the 2 women who are treated as nothing more than property, where Leah is merely a pawn to trick Jacob and who lives a pretty miserable existence after her marriage to him. And the portion of the story that we read today only mentions that Zilpah, Laban's handmaid, was given to Leah as a maid. We don't hear the rest of the story where Leah gives Zilpah and Rachel gives her maid Bilhah to Jacob to have children, just as Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham. We don't think about any of these things when we read this story because we've heard it or stories like it so many times before. This story has become normal. It's what happened a long, long time ago, and we accept it as totally normal, even though it is far from it. A couple weeks ago, I had a Zoom call to record a Wednesday This Is My Story with Amanda Mintz. Amanda is a member of Ithaca Sunday School class and works with our youth. And let me tell you, the Holy Spirit was a-moving on that Zoom call, revealing the word in a new way as the Spirit so often does. Amanda introduced me to Sonia Renee Taylor, a Black author, poet, and activist. Taylor founded a digital media and education company called The Body Is Not an Apology. It promotes radical self-love and body empowerment as the foundational tool for social justice and global transformation. At the beginning of April, just a few weeks into life during coronavirus, practically everyone was clamoring for a return to normal, which I think we are all still hoping for 4 months in. And Sonia Renee Taylor said this: "We will not go back to normal. Normal never was. Our pre-corona existence was not normal, other than we normalized greed, inequity, exhaustion, depletion, extraction, disconnection, confusion, rage, hoarding, hate, and lack. We should not long to return, my friends. We are being given the opportunity to stitch a new garment, one that fits all of humanity and nature." Normal never was. Our story today is not normal, other than we normalized all of the things that happen in it, because that's just the way things were back then. Women were property. They were bought in marriage for a price that roughly equaled 14 years of work. Handmaids, or let's call them what they were, slaves, were given to their mistresses' husbands to bear children. But that's just the way it was then. They didn't know any better, right? Margaret Atwood's 1986 novel, The Handmaid's Tale, gained popularity once again a few years ago with the television series adaptation streaming on Hulu. It seemed like everyone and their mother was both reading and watching The Handmaid's Tale. At least that was the case for me and my mother. In the book, Atwood writes about a radicalized conservative Christian regime. They have rebelled and overtaken the United States, renaming it Gilead. In Gilead, women have no rights. Their bodies are not their own, but instead belong to their husbands or to their closest male relative. The book centers on Offred the handmaid, and her name is Offred because she is of Fred. There's a fertility crisis in Gilead. There are very few people, specifically women, who can reproduce. So all of the fertile women in Gilead, unless they are already married to a commander, are rounded up and forced to serve as handmaids to the commanders and their wives. They're forced to bear their children. It's absolutely terrifying to think about this happening. And you might say that there's no reason to be terrified, because something like Gilead would never happen. That would never be allowed to happen. But here's the thing. It already has. Margaret Atwood has said that she hasn't written anything that hasn't already happened. The biblical precedent in this story for the use of handmaids is the story of Jacob, Rachel, Leah, Bilhah, and Zilpah. Every month in a ritual called the ceremony, this is the Bible story that is read before the commander uses the handmaid as a tool for reproduction. In response to people who have said, this would never happen now, or this could never happen here, Margaret Atwood writes, it can't happen here cannot be depended on. Anything could happen anywhere given the circumstances. When things like our story today are normalized, when things like greed, inequity, exhaustion, depletion, extraction, disconnection, confusion, rage, hoarding, hate, and lack, to use Sonia Renee Taylor's words, are normalized, anything could happen anywhere given the circumstances. Slavery, Jim Crow, voter suppression, same-sex couples denied the right to marry, black men murdered by police officers, mass incarceration, climate change, parents and their children fighting in the same unjust war, sexual harassment and assault, a pandemic killing minority and low-income populations at much higher rates than white populations. And the list could go on and on and on. So what do we do? What do we do when we come across Bible stories like ours today that have been so normalized for us that we don't think twice about them and the pain and the harm that they hold? Here's the thing about the Bible. The stories in it and the people in them are far from perfect. You can see from our story today and many other stories in the Bible that very dark things have happened. These stories are not in the Bible for us to normalize them. They are not there for us to say, well, that's just how things were then. They didn't know any better. God doesn't want us to see these stories as normal and keep moving. These stories are in the Bible for us to be stopped in our tracks and shaken by them, for us to be disturbed, and for us to be moved to action to ensure that things like this do not happen again or do not continue to happen. God is trying to tell a better story, shaking us out of the monotony of acceptance of the way things are or always have been. God is calling us to the abnormal, to new life. Life for every body. Last week, civil rights leader and Congressman John Lewis died. John Lewis spent his life fighting against what was normal. He was one of the original freedom riders who were determined to ride from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans in an integrated fashion because it was normal. for states to enforce laws prohibiting black and white folks from sitting next to each other. He was one of the key organizers of the 1963 March on Washington because it was normal and legal for black people to be denied civil and economic rights. In 1965, he marched, was beaten, and arrested in Selma, Alabama, on what has become known as Bloody Sunday because racial discrimination in voting was normal. And John Lewis continued to fight against racial discrimination in voting until his death. And these things are but a few components to a life spent pushing for the abnormal, for life and rights for all people. In June of 2018, John Lewis tweeted, "Do not get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful. Be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble. Necessary trouble." The struggle John Lewis is talking about is the struggle against what our world has normalized. Greed, inequity, exhaustion, depletion, extraction, disconnection, confusion, rage, hoarding, hate, and lack. All of these have been normalized in our world, and we can't accept it. We can't accept this story of Jacob, Rachel, and Leah as normal. That's not what God is calling us to. God is calling us to speak up and out against these things, to fight for what is abnormal in our world. Generosity instead of greed. Equity instead of inequity. Plenty instead of lack. Connection instead of disconnection. Love instead of hate. This is how we stitch a new garment, one that fits all of humanity and nature. This is good and necessary trouble. Sure, this new garment may be abnormal for our world, but when has God's way ever been normal? Amen.